Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on adding in our new items data to our world scene. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be links to previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. So now that we're able to go ahead and parse our item data from tiled, and we're able to add those game objects to our scene and pick them up, what we need to do is now we need to finish our logic, and we need to first add in collisions, so then that way our player doesn't collide with those game objects. And then secondly, is we actually need to go ahead and update our inventory to actually have that new item instance, and then that way we can increment the number of potions our player actually has. We'll want to go ahead and round that out by adding in logic to go ahead and keep track of which items from our world scene our player has picked up, so that way they can only pick them up one time for each of their game instances. So to get started with these changes, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add in our collisions. And so to support this, what we'll do is let's jump over to our character class. And what we'll want to do is we're going to update our configuration so we can go ahead and pass in a new layer that we can go ahead and check. All right, so what we'll go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and add a new property. And for this property, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this optional, and we're just going to call this objects to check for collision with. All right, so for this property, we want to go ahead and have an array of objects. And for these objects, we don't want it to be specific to our item that we just created. Instead, we want this to be generic, so then that way we can reuse it across our game for other types of objects we might want to check for collisions with. And so for this property, what we want is, all we really care about is what position that object is in our scene. So then that way when our character moves, we can compare their position with the position of that object. And so for this type, what we're going to expect is we're going to expect an array of objects. So we'll go ahead and have our object, and we'll expect an array of them. And at a minimum for our object, we just need our position property. And so for our position property, this will be a type of our coordinate. Let's go ahead and import that in. And that's the only property we're gonna care about on this object. So as long as our objects have this position property, we can allow it into this array. So then once we have our new property, we just need to go ahead and add that to our class. And so we'll go ahead and add a new protected property, and let's do objects to check for collisions with. And for our type, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this here. And then what we'll do is we'll just add in our JS doc types. And so we'll do at protected and at type, and we'll go ahead and add in our type definition. So then what we'll do is down in our constructor, we'll go ahead and set this if it is provided. So we'll have objects to check for collision with will be equal to our config dot objects to check for collisions with, and we'll default to an empty array if this property is not provided. So then with our new property, what we want to go ahead and do is we need to go ahead and add a new method to compare our player's position with our position of the game object to see if they're going to collide. So what we'll do is let's come down to the bottom of our class. We'll go ahead and add in a new method. And so for this method, we'll do does position collide with object. And so we'll expect position for our parameter, and we'll go ahead and return a Boolean. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this here for our JS doc types. And so then in our code, we're going to want to do similar logic to what we did for our does player collide with other character. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this block of code here. We're going to paste this, and we're going to change this to be our objects to check for collisions with. So if our array length is 0, we don't need to do anything. We'll just return false. Otherwise, what we want to do is in our array, we want to find to see if there's any of those objects where our positions are equal. So very similar to this logic here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to copy this block of code here. We're going to go ahead and paste it, and we're going to change our variable name, and we'll do collides with object. We'll go ahead and update our reference to use the correct array, and we won't have character, we're going to have item. Now for our logic, because our items won't actually move, we don't need to check their previous target position. We just need their current position. And so we're just going to go ahead and return, and we won't do item. We want this to be generic, so we're just going to say object. So we'll have object, and so if our object position dot x is equal to our x, or our object position y is equal to our y, Then we can go ahead and return our collides with object Boolean value. So with our new method, we just need to go ahead and add this to where we check for collisions in our logic. So let's go ahead and come up to our method for is blocking tile, and we're just going to go ahead and add another or statement. So or does position collide with object, we'll pass in updated position, then that way our character should now be able to detect if we're going to collide with an item. So now what we'll want to do is over in our world scene, we want to go ahead and pass in those objects we're going to check for collisions with. So let's jump over to our world scene and let's go to where we create our player. And so we'll do this, we'll do our player equals. And so inside here, we're just going to do other objects to check for collisions with. And we're just going to go ahead and pass in our items array for the time being. So once our game refreshes, we should go ahead and test our changes. So in our scene, if we start moving around and we come down to where one of our items are, now our player shouldn't be able to actually pass through that object in our scene. So now that we have our collision logic in place for our items in our player, what we want to do next is now we need to enhance our data manager. And so let's go ahead and jump over to our data manager. And what we want to do is we want to keep track of any items that we've already picked up from our world scene. And then that way the player can actually pick them up again. And so to keep track of this, we're going to go ahead and add some new properties to our initial state. And so what we'll do is we'll make a new property. And for this property, this is going to be a number array. And we're just going to call this items picked up. So inside this array, what we'll do is we're going to keep track of the IDs of our items that we've actually picked up. And then when we create those items in our world scene, we won't actually create those when our scene loads if they've already been picked up by the player. So with our new property, what we'll do is let's go ahead and add that to our initial state, and we're just going to set this to an empty array. So now we want to go ahead and add that to our data manager store keys. And so I'm just going to copy inventory and change this to be items picked up. And for our value, we'll do the same value. And now we'll want to come down to where we do our initial state. And so when we start our new game, let's just do existing data, and we'll do our items picked up, and that's going to be equal to our initial state. We'll make a copy of it. So we'll do item, our initial state, and we want our items picked up. All right, and then finally, let's come down to where we update our data manager, and we want to go ahead and copy this, and then we'll want to go ahead and add in our new data store key, and so we'll have items picked up, and from our data, we want to go ahead and grab items picked up. All right, so for the rest of our class, let's come down to update data manager. Let's go ahead and copy our line of code tied to our inventory. We'll change this to items picked up. And so we'll have our data, and we'll grab items picked up from that. And then down in our data manager data to global state object method, we want to go ahead and add in our new items picked up. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to make a copy of this store.get. And we want to use our data manager store keys, and we want to grab items picked up. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and add a fallback. So then that way, if this is not defined, we'll go ahead and just return an empty array. And so by doing that, because this won't exist on our existing saved data, this will add it as a fallback automatically for us. All right, so if we save our changes when our scene refreshes, we should see that our data loads without any issues. So now that we have our items picked up property on our data manager, what we need to do is we need to add in some methods for us to be able to pick up items in our game. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to where we have our update inventory. And so what we're going to do is first we're going to go ahead and add in a method to allow us to add an item to our inventory. And then that way we don't have to pass our whole inventory that needs to be saved. And so for this method, I'm just going to call this add item. And so we're going to have two parameters. The first will be our item that we would like to actually add, and then we're going to have a quantity. And then that way we can say, hey, they picked up 2 of something or 1, however many we want to add to our inventory. And then real quick, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to go ahead and add in our JS doc types. And so for our param of item, we're going to go ahead and this will be our item from our type definition. And then quantity will be a number. So inside our method, what we'll want to do is we'll need to grab our existing inventory from our data manager, and then we want to go ahead and see if we already have one of those items in our inventory. If we do, we just want to go ahead and increment our quantity tied to that item. Otherwise, we need to go ahead and actually add that item to our array. So to go ahead and do this, we're just going to do const And we'll do inventory is going to be equal to this, our store, and we'll use our get method, and we'll do our data manager store keys, and let's grab our inventory. So after we grab our inventory, we want to see if the item actually exists, and so we'll have existing item, and we'll set equal to our inventory dot find, and we're looking for our inventory item, and what we want to do is we want to see if our inventory item dot item dot ID is equal to the item that we passed in, the ID there. So once we have that, we'll know if we actually have that item. So if we have an existing item, so if that's true, then for our existing item, we want to go ahead and just update our quantity. And so we're just going to increment it by the quantity that we passed in, and we'll go ahead and return early. If it was not found, then on our inventory, we want to go ahead and push in a new item. And so we want to go ahead and push our item and our quantity for that item. And then finally, we'll go ahead and update our data managers. We'll do this, we'll do our store, and we'll use the set method, and we'll do our data manager store keys, and we want to reference our inventory, and we'll pass in inventory. And then actually what we're going to want to go ahead and do is we need to get rid of our return here, and we're just going to wrap this in an else. And then that way, in both cases, we'll update our data manager. All right, so now we have our add item method. We need to go ahead and add a new method that will allow us to update our items picked up array to have the item ID that the player just picked up. And so for this one, I'm going to call this add item picked up, and we're just going to pass in our item ID. So for our JS doc types real quick, our param item ID is just going to be a number. So what we want to do in this method is first we need to go ahead and grab our items picked up array. And so I'm just going to do const, we'll do items picked up. We'll set equal to this, our store, and we want to get our data manager store keys and our items picked up property. And what we'll do is we're just going to add a fallback for an empty array. So if this property doesn't exist in our data store, we'll just go ahead and return an empty array. And then that way, when we save the updated value, it will then exist. And then real quick for our type, what we'll do is it's just going to be a number array. So now we'll want to go ahead and do our items picked up, and we just want to go ahead and push in our new item ID. And then finally, we just want to use our store. We want to use our set method, and we want to go ahead and set our data manager store keys and our items picked up. And we want our items picked up array. All right, so with that method, now we should be able to pick up one of our items in our world scene. And so like if this was item ID 1, we could put that in our array. And then when we reload our game, we'll need to check to see if that item's ID has already been picked up. All right, so with that change, now we have the methods we need in our data manager for us to be able to persist our data about our items that we've picked up in our game. All right, so with those changes, let's jump over to our world scene. And the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is when we check to see if there's an item nearby and we pick up that item, we're going to go ahead and call our new methods. So let's come down to our logic for where our player picks up our item. And so in our handle player interaction method, we'll come down to the bottom. So if there is an item nearby, what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and grab the item from our data utils. Before we destroy our game object, let's call our data manager, and we'll do add item. And what we'll do is we'll pass in our item, and we'll go ahead and pass in 1 for our quantity. Then after we go ahead and remove this from our array, we'll go ahead and call our data manager, and we'll do add item picked up, and we'll do our nearby item, and we want to go ahead and pass in our ID. So then this will handle when we need to store these values, and then for when we retrieve them, that's going to be down in our create items method. So if we come down to the bottom of our class, let's come down to our create items method, and what we want to do is after we filter our array to get our valued items, we want to go ahead and grab all of our items that we've already picked up from our game. And so what we'll do is we'll do const, we'll do items picked up, and we're going to set this equal to our data manager. We'll grab our store property, and we'll use our get method, and we'll want our data manager store keys, and we want our items picked up. And we're just going to add a fallback for it to be an empty array if there is no data. And then for our type, I'm just going to copy this real quick, paste it here, and this will be a number array. So now down in our for loop, when we're creating instances of our item, what we're going to go ahead and do is after we have our ID, we're just going to see if that exists in our items picked up array. If it does exist, we don't need to create that item when our scene first starts. So what we'll do is we'll do if our items picked up includes the ID of our new object, then we want to go ahead and just continue in our loop and not create an instance of that item. All right, so with our changes, we should be able to go ahead and save and test everything. So real quick, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and go into my bag. We see we have our 10 potions that we initially add. And so I'm just going to go ahead and save my game. And I'm going to come down to my item. So we still have our collisions. And if we interact with the item, it says, hey, I found a potion. And now if I go into my bag, we can see we've updated our data. And now we have 11 potions. And so before I go ahead and save again, I'm going to go ahead and refresh. All right, so if we refresh our game, what we should be able to do is go into our bag. We should be back to 10 items because we didn't save our data. And our items should reappear in our game. So now if I pick it up, go back into my bag, we have 11. And let's go ahead and save our data this time. So once our game reloads, we should see now our item no longer appears on our map. And if we go into our bag, we should still have our 11 potions. All right, with that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to go ahead and switch back to tiled, and we're going to start adding in support for having multiple areas in our game. And we're going to go ahead and focus on adding some buildings. And so we'll be building out our building's interior, and we'll be connecting that to our main level tiled file. So as a reminder, there is a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.